Today on The State of Us, what is school for? Wasting time and money? Maybe. Let's talk about it. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal, and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson. Today, we're looking at an opinion piece in the New York Times by an economist, Brian Kaplan, who is a professor of economics at George Mason University and the author of Open Borders and the Case Against Education. So quite the resume this gentleman has, but we're going to be looking at a central piece in a section of the New York Times that was entitled, What is Education For? And there's a whole bunch of different ideas here about what is the purpose of education, something that I don't think we talk about as a society that frequently. Well, school is so you can get a diploma, but why? What is the purpose behind it? Why do we spend this time and money to get you this diploma? And the point of this article, at least his contention, in a nutshell, is that first, everyone leaves school eventually. Second, most of what you learn in school doesn't matter after graduation. Third, human beings soon forget knowledge they rarely use. Now, we're going to dive into all that a good bit deeper, but that's basically what we're looking at today. Is school simply a waste of time and money for what we think it's supposed to do?
Well, I think therein lies the rub. When I read the piece, obviously being in education for almost 40 years, I started to take offense to with the title. As I read it, though, as with any opinion, there are tidbits of information in there that I think are true. But when you look at the piece as a whole, the article as a whole, schools for everyone, schools for us, schools for merit, schools for social mobility. To me, that's where the problem is that we have over 300 million people in the United States. We have a Department of Education, and we don't agree on what is the sole purpose of school. And that's why I think we have this push of, well, give parents the right to choose, right? Mobility with their tax dollars to different schools is because every set of parents has a different goal for what they want school to be. So let's dig into this guy's piece. But I think there's the problem, right? I mean, overall overreaching is that we don't agree on what school is for as a society.
Well, one of the things that he points out in the article, which I think is a fundamental understanding of something that we've discussed before on the program, is that, what is the purpose of an education, right? The blind spot is especially odd because there's a clean explanation of both piles of evidence. Namely, school is lucrative primarily because it certifies or signals employability. Most education isn't job training. It's a passport to the real training, which happens on the job. That's why graduation pays individuals so well. You don't learn much in your last few weeks of school, but completion persuades employers to trust you. And that's why credential proliferation pays countries so poorly. Handing out ever more high school, college, and grad school diplomas can't enrich society as a whole unless students durably learn long-term skills along the way. In other words, his contention is that even though his view is a minority view among fellow economists who have piles of evidence that education has a big effect on what adults learn, they're basically right, but that's no excuse for ignoring the piles of evidence that education has little effect on what adults know. In other words, here's that back to the rub, right, of what is education for? Well, if it's to know things, then what this guy is contending, right, for wasting time and money is pretty much what we end up doing. That's probably true, because if you test most adults on what they were supposed to have learned in high school, they would perform pretty abysmally on the knowledge, right? The actual retention of facts, information, processes. They're not very good at that. But if we're testing them on for example, problem solving, or those soft skills, some of those things might perform better. But that leads up to a bigger question then of what we led off the show with, what is school for? Because if it's for knowledge, strict memorization of facts and information and formulas and, reciting of scientific information, if that's what it's for, historical details, then we fail miserably and we waste a ton of time and money doing it. But if that's not what it's for, if it's for developing a whole person, providing childcare, setting people up to learn how to solve problems.
So my contention is when he talks about the proliferation of handing out diplomas, therein lies my contention about education. We have continued to lower the standards while saying we've made it more difficult. For example, I only needed 18 credits to graduate. Today, the school district that I worked in and retired from requires 22. So they say, oh, you've upped the standard. But the work that I did in high school, and this is old white man talking, right? But even the students that I taught.
Boomer trigger warning.
But I'm being open about it. But even the young man that I taught, who is across the booth from me, and my children who went to that same school 15 years ago, what they did is more than is what is required of students today. Because we got to this point where, well, you need a high school diploma to get a decent job, which this person's article makes that assumption. I agree. But it used to be harder to get a diploma. Therefore, even if you did have to get trained on the job, there was this belief by the employer that you had worked hard enough to obtain something that not everybody got. And then about 20, 25 years ago, we had a change in our society that said, well, we need to educate everybody. And we need to get, and everybody can get a high school diploma. Everybody, President Clinton, college for everyone. It's all going to be paid for by the government because this is the social way to climb the ladder, to gain access to the wealth that the United States has. We'd never done that before. That was a total shift. All right. Total shift towards, well, everybody's going to be able to do this. And that's not what we did 15 to 30 years ago. But that's the whole point, is we have spent so many years dumbing down the curriculum that now we are turning out people who can't do a job. They have a college diploma and they can't do their job right. I mean, another boomer alert. I'm frustrated because I go into places and people can't do their job right. They got hired, they've got the diploma, they've got the degree, and they're still making mistakes at their job. Why? Because my contention is we've dumbed it down to where there's no expectation to get it done right.
We saw that the more people, right, that people who earned a diploma, a high school diploma, and then subsequently people who earned a college diploma were able to achieve higher levels of earning on average than their counterparts who did not achieve those things, and that college equaled more earning on average than high school. So what we said is, again, if this, then that. If that's true, which it appeared to be, then what we need is for more people to get these diplomas. The issue is that we lost context in there of what made the diploma valuable. Simply handing the diploma to people doesn't make it valuable. The other thing, and we talked, I don't know how many times I've said this about college. I think it's part of why we've seen the issue that we've run into with higher education and its value today being less than it used to be, is it's the law of supply and demand, folks. It's a microeconomic model, and it's basically, it talks about how prices are determined in a market. Ultimately, way oversimplifying, but the law of supply and demand is holding all else equal in a competitive market, which is what we have. The unit price of a particular good or service or financial asset, which in this case is a person, will vary until it settles at a point where the quantity demanded will equal the quantity supplied, resulting in equilibrium. What does all that mean? Well, the concept of supply and demand forms the theoretical basis of all modern economics. In other words, if there are 20 people out of 100 people with a high school diploma, those 20 can demand more money. But now if there's 60 people with a high school diploma, those 60 are vying for the same value that those 20 were vying for. So it's not that those 60 aren't just as good as those 20, but instead of there only being 20, there are now 60 of them. So the available value that we can disperse is less. Now, the other, counter to that is obviously that the more people who have a higher degree, the more innovative we ought to be as a society, the more things we ought to be able to start, and therefore the more jobs, opportunities, and money should exist for people with more education. Yes, but that doesn't just happen overnight just because we have more people with diplomas. Again, that goes back to the very beginning of what is the value of the diploma in the first place. Yes, the more people that have it, the less valuable it becomes, and the more people that want it, the more expensive it becomes, also law of supply and demand, because the available amount of higher education institutions are limited and their ability to serve students is limited. So if there are more people that want it and we can't give it to everybody that wants it, the price goes up. At the same time, more people are getting it than ever before, which means the value of it goes down. So we've said, hey, this is really important to get, and then we've totally upended the equation of what a diploma is. We still call it that, but is it the same thing that it was when we set out and said we need more people to have these? Well, no, because we made 50 changes along the way that totally upended what the diploma was versus what it is today. We're going to talk a little bit too about what do the test scores reveal about what we've done to education. Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. Let's talk about the 3 R's. Some of our favorites: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Fewer than 1% of American adults even claim to have learned to speak a foreign language very well in school, even when 2 years of coursework in foreign language is now standard. Adults' knowledge of history and civics is negligible at best. If you test the most elementary facts, like naming the 3 branches of government, the average American adult gets about half correct. The same goes for questions of basic science, like are electrons smaller than atoms? And do antibiotics kill viruses as well as bacteria? How bad are these scores? Very bad. If you know half the letters in the alphabet, we don't call you half literate, we correctly call you illiterate. I say the same goes for lack of elementary knowledge of history, civics, and science. If you don't know half the basics of history, civics, and science, you really don't understand history, civics, or science at all. The payoff for teaching basic literacy and numeracy is admittedly much larger. Since adults regularly use reading, writing, and math, they retain much of what they learn. Even here, though, schools' performance is mediocre and unlikely to meaningfully improve. Schools have been trying to overcome reading, writing, and math defects among underperforming students for decades. Boosting their performance in the short run is quite doable. The recurring problem is fade out. The effects of interventions diminish or disappear over time.
But what is school for?
Right.
Okay. What if school is to do that, then that's fine. Then we don't need to have free lunch programs. We don't need to have social safe places. We don't need to have run the buses to get them there. We don't need to do all of these other things that schools try to do. Career training, all of those things. If all we're supposed to do is teach reading, writing, and math, fine, do that. There's no teacher in the world who would argue against that. As a matter of fact, most of my colleagues, we spent our entire career saying, what is it you want us to do? Do you want us to play psychologist and help these kids feel better about themselves? Do you want us to teach the subject matter? If it is the subject matter, what subject matter is it that you want us to teach them? If it's something else, let us know. And my years as an educator have been about every 5 to 7 years, the direction of the public school changes. Well, now we're going to focus on this. Okay, so we all focus on that for a few years. And then they say, well, now the focus is this. And usually it's driven by the parents or social media or the government saying, well, this is a problem. Politicians, well, we have to fix this. Okay, well, when we have to fix this, we'll get that. I'll give you an example. There was no standardized testing when I started teaching. We had a 9th grade test in Ohio. We had it for like 7 or 8 years. I could be corrected on the length, but so many students passed it that the state decided that, at first nobody passed it. I mean, like 20%. But within 8 or 9 years, teachers had done such a good job of teaching what was, required to know on the test that students were passing it at like a 90% rate. So the state said, oh, well, you didn't achieve anything. Now we have to change it. And we're going to give the test to sophomores. And the test changed. And again, the first year everybody took the sophomore test, of which my students were some test dummies, dropped below 30%, passed it. Then we went for another 7 or 8 years. And again, we got graduation. We got the requirement passing the test over 90%. So what they do now, they're in Ohio, they have graduation tests where you take the test to see whether or not you get to graduate. So within a 30-year span, we said, well, you have to know this to graduate. And it was a freshman level test. Then we switched and said, no, this is what you have to know to graduate. And it's a sophomore level test. And now we are in the phase of, well, now this is what you have to know. It's a graduation test. And the thing is, teachers met the standards every time. But what do the politicians do? They change the standard. They change the desire on what it is we want them to know.
As you were talking about that, it made me think about the value of any product, right? And how we as a society view things, and not society, but just as humans. And what came to mind is several studies that I like that were done on wine, because this is a constant question of, I can spend $10 on a bottle of wine, or I can spend $10,000 on a bottle of wine. Does it make a difference? Some people are going to be very mad with this answer. Yes and no. And there's a very important distinction on whether or not it makes a difference. They ran this study 2 different ways, Lance. The first way is that they took the labels and the price tags off the bottles of wine, right? So you couldn't see the label. You could not see, as far as everybody could tell, they were indistinguishable from one another. The only way that people knew they were different is they told them this is an option and this is an option. We want you to taste both and tell us which you like better. Which one do you think is more expensive? When they took enthusiasts, when they took people who had never had wine before, everybody consistently got it about half right. In other words, about as good as a quarter flip, right? Mm-hmm. Was what it was. Which one did you like better? So you guessed which one was more expensive. You guessed which one you liked better. Almost all the time, the one that people guessed was more expensive was also the one that they thought tasted better. Mm. Now, when you bring back in the picture of the $10 bottle of wine, or let's just make it a little more reasonable, a $100 bottle of wine, this time they're labeled and the prices are on them. We're not asking you to tell us which one's more expensive, but we are asking you to tell us which one you like better. Well, no surprise, by far and away, the majority of people, enthusiasts and otherwise, agreed that the $100 bottle of wine tasted better. What happens when they switched?
The price tags.
The price tags. Well, everybody agreed that the more expensive wine tasted better.
So the $10 bottle was better tasting wine when it had a $100 price tag on it.
Yes.
Is that what you're trying to say?
And this is not, and folks, this is not just your brain fooling you, okay? This is a real psychological phenomenon that psychologists have identified of we generally believe that, and it's not just a belief, it's an actual feeling inside. It's an emotional response. We enjoy things more when we are told they're more valuable. If we paid $100 for a bottle of wine, or if somebody gave us a bottle of wine and we looked it up and it's like, oh my gosh, this is $100. Isn't that amazing that somebody gave me this? You will enjoy it more simply because you believe it has more value. And you believing it has more value gives it more value. The point being, what does any of this have to do with education? We have moved the goalposts, but keep handing out the same price tag and the same sticker. So people expect that education is going to taste as good as it always has. And then we're shocked and surprised to see that, well, I used to know what this $100 bottle of wine tasted like, and now it tastes like a $10 bottle of wine. What happened? You're telling me that it's worth this,
right?
But I've had $100 and this doesn't taste like that. So what's going on? What has happened? You're labeling it the same, but something has changed. We're saying it's worth that, but then when we get out in the real world and people actually put it to the test, unlike wine, which you can only distinguish so much when it's unlabeled, if somebody does or doesn't know something, it becomes clear pretty quickly if you've hired them to do a specific skill or job.
I think that's a fair point, and it's a great explanation of what I was trying to say, in that it's not the same. If you're sitting here and you're driving, or you're sitting there and listening to this show, think about what you had to do to graduate from high school, and then ask your child or your grandchild or your great-grandchild what they're doing to graduate and get that diploma. Or if you you graduated from college, ask those same people, what are they doing to get out of college, and then draw your own conclusions. Is it more difficult now, or is it easier now? My claim is that it's easier now. They make it sound harder because they have to take more classes, but dig in there, dig past the top mantle of the soil and dig in there. But what are they being required to do? What are they being asked to do?
Well,
what's the standard,
to what level?
And what level is it? Ask them, can I read your latest essay that you wrote for language class? Can I take a look at the science test that you got an A on? Look at it and see, is it the same material? Is it to the same depth that you learned? And it might be, and kudos to those schools. But I think in many aspects, it's not, because the pressure now is to get that piece of paper in a student's hands. That's what parents expect. That's what the politicians expect. That's what society expects. So what have schools become? They've become paper hangers. They just lowered the standards to be able to hand out the paperwork so that everybody pats them on the back and says they're doing a good job, and give them their tax money to stay in operation. Because if you make it too hard, then the parents say, well, I'm going to go somewhere with a school voucher, and I'm going to go somewhere else that will get them the diploma. And again, this is no front on teachers. Teachers are doing, as they've always done, what they are told to do. They are pretty much rule followers, and they will do whatever it is that the district and that the government and that the politicians say they have to do, even if they don't think it's what's the best.
So what is the value of a modern education? Well, Brian Kaplan, the professor of economics at George Mason University, has a specific idea about what value it really provides. Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. When schools shuttered, they stopped performing their sole, undeniably valuable function, according to Brian Kaplan. That's providing daycare. In-person schooling allows parents to work full-time without distraction. In-person schooling allows parents to take care of infants and elders. In-person schooling allows parents to finish their household chores, and in-person schooling allows parents to relax. School closures were a disaster for convenience. And while you'll never hear a convenience above all political speech, actions speak louder than words. By February of 2021, about 90%, 9 in 10 private schools serving elementary or middle schoolers offered in-person instruction. Why? Presumably because they knew that parents cherish the convenience of in-person education. Fewer than half of corresponding public schools funded by taxes rather than paying customers were fully open by that time. Many large districts stayed closed or in hybrid mode for over a year. While the pedagogical cost of closure remains speculative, the convenience costs are beyond all doubt. If we set aside wishful thinking and calmly reflect on what happened to education during COVID, we learn two valuable lessons. First, schools before COVID gave taxpayers a bad deal, taking lavish funding while imparting little long-term knowledge. Second, schools during COVID gave taxpayers an even worse deal, enjoying enormous emergency funding while refusing to provide at least daycare in exchange. Even before COVID, American schools were spending over $15,000 a year per student. Is there any way to get better value for our money? The most straightforward way is to spend a lot less of it. American schools will never make American students bilingual, so why waste precious resources pretending otherwise? The same goes for most of the curriculum.
Where do you want me to start?
Well, I think this segment is about what do we think about that? But also, in our mind, what does school need to become?
Well, there are 2 points. One, I do agree with the premise that too many people, and even some parents, school is a daycare system because they have to pay for childcare until they start school. And there is evidence, and we can look it up, but they've done the studies. Many of the students who have trouble in school are students who were started at a young age in school.
Too early.
They were started too early, except the school. Now, here's the thing, right? The parent wants the child in school because they save on daycare costs, and maybe mom or dad now want to work more hours because they don't have to take care of the child at home. The recipient of the said student, the school, wants the child in school because they are rewarded by the state and the federal government for the number of students that they have in their school. So both entities are driven by economics, not by what is the best educational decision for the child. So there's that, okay? I do agree with that premise that he says they serve the purpose of a daycare. However, and this was a political cartoon I had on my wall for over 25 years, it is a teacher talking to a politician, and the teacher asks very simply, why don't you pay me what you pay a babysitter? And the politician says, sure. And the teacher then begins to rattle off, this is what a babysitter makes, multiply it times the 30 students in my room, multiply it times the number of hours I work, times the number of days that I work, and it was the final math number. See, there's something to be learned. You can do math as well as politics from a political cartoon. But the final number was 4 times the average teacher salary in the United States at that time. And of course, the politician said, well, there's no way we can afford that. So I take umbrage at his point that it is wasted money, because even if, and I don't believe it is, but even if it is a daycare center, it does it at a cheaper cost than what daycare cost. But I think schools provide so much more than that. So with that, I will disagree with him, okay? I do think on both sides, like I said, the parent sees it, well, now they're in school, I can do X, Y, and Z. And the schools say, well, now that they're in school, we'll take them because we get more money to operate on. And again, we didn't make the decision based on what's best for the education of that child. So I agree with his statement that it is a daycare center, but I don't agree that it's a waste of money. Plus, I don't agree at all that that's all it performs. But even if it does, it's cheaper than what it would cost. I don't know what you have to say. And I mean, that's the way I take that. All right. So I agree with his premise, but I don't agree that it's bad. And I obviously don't agree that that's the only thing schools do. So I still think it's a pretty good pretty good deal financially.
I think it's just a mismatch of the whole point of the show. What is school for? We've convinced society that the purpose of school is to turn out a diploma, and the way we do that is with good test scores. So that's what, again, does this knowledge actually benefit you somehow later in life? Well, we haven't really asked that question, because we don't really care, because that's not what we've been sold on the premise of school being. We don't really care if you can explain the Pythagorean theorem 10 years down the road after you've been out of school. The question then becomes, why are we spending time teaching that? And the answer often, right, is because, well, learning a variety of different things helps open your mind, expand your problem solving, all of which are true. The question becomes, but why are we doing it with the Pythagorean theorem for people that don't need the Pythagorean theorem? If we know that retention is improved among skills that people use on a regular basis, why would we not design classes and education in a way that, rather than focused on providing great standardized test scores in subjects that most people don't use most of their life, nor can they recall most of the information 10 years after being outside of school, why would we not teach the same principles, the same problem solving, the same social interaction skills with things that people need in their ongoing everyday life? Things that they'd actually retain. Why? Because they use them regularly.
So if they need to know math skills, why don't you teach them a budget? Why don't you teach them how to pay their rent or pay their mortgage, pay their taxes, right? Do tax forms, have a savings account, teach them investment. If you invest this much money every year, every month, and you get this kind of return, here's what you'll have at X number, XYZ years. There's all kinds of math you can teach that people get out in the real world and they're like, okay, I can prove that that three-lined object is a triangle, but I can't form a budget.
Right.
I don't know what.
Great.
I know people have told me that it's valuable to save money, but how valuable is it? And again, if we did word problems and math problems that way, those would be math skills that many people, young adults out there, your age group even, millennials, would be better prepared for what they faced when they got out of high school or when they got out of college and started working. And they're like, okay, I have all this money, but I don't have any money because it's all gone. Well, why is it all gone? Well, because nobody ever told me I had to pay for my phone. I had to pay car insurance. I had to pay rent or mortgage. I had to pay home insurance or renter's insurance. I had to pay this and the price of groceries and on and on and on and on. Why? Because that was never taught to them at school.
Right.
So they didn't know that. So they took this job thinking, this is more money than I've ever seen. I'm used to working at Dairy Queen in the summer and just having a couple $100. And wow, I'm going to make $40,000, $50,000 a year now. I've got all kinds of money. And then they go try to live and they're like, I don't have any money. Why? Because we didn't teach them those things. So to your point, there's a lot of math that you can teach that would be beneficial to young people when they first start their careers.
And we know how important literacy and reading are, yet we teach them often in subjects that most students find dull and or boring and don't recite frequently. What if reading was taught more specifically toward history, civics, and current political events? All of a sudden, this is something that people can use on an ongoing basis. There's more reason to pay attention to. And in science, rather than teaching...
Wait a minute, can we pick up a newspaper? You mean we put newspapers back in school and have... I guess we could have them do it online too, right? But
yeah,
but they could read newspapers and here's what's going on, right? And oh, wow. And ask them, questions about what it is they read, right? I mean, the same questions you ask about when they read Romeo and Juliet or when they read Macbeth or, whatever great novel, the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens, whatever you had them read, you could have them read a newspaper and ask them the same questions, the same style of questions, and then they would be more immersed into their own culture and their own government. Amazing thought.
And instead of teaching science in abstract principles and with textbooks, why don't we teach it in baking and cooking class? You want them to learn this information. You want them to gain a valuable real-world skill. Let's do it. Let's show them how to fix their car or how to change the oil or whatever it might be. There are lots of ways to teach scientific principles other than sitting in front of a textbook and talking about an atom, which nobody can even see in class, and why this matters to you. And like, by the time I've already explained it this far, most people have, dozed off already. Notice that I said most people, right? Yeah, we need people that want to learn this stuff, right? But that's maybe 5%, of all.
We'll go back
students.
to your supply and demand, right? Then all of a sudden we would have the people who were interested in it would meet, and they would be paid accordingly, because there wouldn't be a plethora of those people.
Mm-hmm.
There wouldn't be so many that they're devalued.
Yep.
That they would have that interest and they would go and do those things.
My understanding of science drastically improved when I spent more time cooking and baking. Because things that I didn't even realize were principles that we, may have touched on at some point that I had to relearn. Once I learned them and were using them on a regular basis, it was not hard to remember. And I think that's the point of we've decided that we're teaching to a test to earn a piece of paper, and we've not decided what we want the piece of paper to signal. Well, it signals that you can get a job. Not really. And then we've also subsequently said, well, we're going to make you know more things to get this, but the level at which you know them, we don't expect to be as high.
Yeah, no depth to the knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're going to know, all these things, but you're not going to really.
The width is great, but the depth is not.
Is negligible. So yeah, if you were asking Lance and I how we change education, I think that'd be a big part of it. What is it for? Well, it's for creating value. And in order to create value for society, we have to, yes, address the daycare component, making sure that children are fed, cared for, and enabling us to work, adults. But we also have to say, well, what if we change the way we're teaching what we teach to give them things that improved retention? They're going to be here anyway. They're going to spend this time here anyway. If we know retention stinks, and if we know we've lowered the standards, why not try to improve retention and up the standards and do it in a way that people could use on an ongoing basis? Because that's what will improve retention and will improve the value of the diploma. Why do we have this conversation, Lance?
So true. Well, because here at True Chat, we have a mission, and our mission is to educate people. See that? Educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And if you've enjoyed today's show, we'd love for you to tell your family and friends and your coworkers. And if they say, well, this sounds interesting, I might want to listen. How do I find it? Tell them as a podcast. They can find The State of Us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us releases new podcast episodes Tuesdays and Thursdays, first thing in the morning. Those same episodes are heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the United States and parts of Canada. For The State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to producer Bradley Butch. Thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.